This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
So, hopefully that doesn't scare anyone off, and it's useful for your studies. So just give me a moment to share my screen. Okay. Thanks for your patience. And hopefully good to go. That can be seen?
Yes, we can see that. Thanks.
Right. Okie doke. So I'll just start off by talking to the main focus of last week's lecture, which was the creation of the network plan, and I'll just quickly summarise what we discussed there. As I said at the time, the network plan is really the cornerstone of a retailer's growth strategy. That is what dictates where they want to go, why they want to go there, when they want to go there, and what they want to go into that location with, typically in the form of a store size. It is really a blueprint, and it's really quite essential, so that you're guided by some science and reason when you roll out a brand, and that you're doing so to maximise your chances of success. New stores for a business, historically, this is now changing given the onset of online, but new stores were typically the best source of incremental sales growth or headline sales growth for a business to actually grow in scale. So that's why increasing their store size is enticing, their store fleet is enticing rather, in terms of the number of stores. But when you do so, the capital required in the form of fitting out a store with a really nice look and feel, and the costs of leasing the store and then operating the store are all quite substantial. So there's a lot of scrutiny from a company's perspective. The finance teams are really quite stringent to make sure that the use of capital for a new store, which is normally quite significant, depending on what type of retailer you are, is being used in the best way. So that's why it really helps to have a really robust strategy and an explanation as to why you're wanting to go into the locations that you are. And there's an abundance of information out there that will support and help someone in deciding what is best for their retailer, and we'll touch on that a bit later. So that's really the context setting component of the first step is that context setting component of the network plan. I've just broadly alluded to the conceptual reasons as to why you'd want one. The context setting can take a number of different shapes, forms and sizes, and I'll power through this because we discussed it last week, but you want to know fundamentally about population. Retailers about people. The more people that you're closer to, the better. Where is the population increasing? Competition and what the competition looks like. That's fundamentally the broad macro factors that you should be starting with. the hotspot map or the scorecard approach is what we're going to look at today, and I'll cover that in great detail. Once you've got those more refined locations, you want to be able to test them and check that, does this really make sense? You bring it to life in a GIS so you can clearly see it, and then you look at what else is around so that you can say, right, do we want to go there? Does it make sense? Do we already have a store there? And what does the competition look like? And as I mentioned, our property intelligence process with that map on the screen, that's what enables us to know what the competition looks like, where they are, and helps us make wise and well-informed decisions. The gravity model, which I'll run through today, which is an important retail economics and spatial economics concept that is widely utilised. Reviewing and testing the gaps again, just making sure that what we're saying makes sense and making sure that humans still have a use rather than outsourcing everything to a computer. Assigning the selling floor area, the SFA, how big we want the store to be, or the retailer needs the store to be. If you're going second to market up against a competitor, you typically want to bring something that is as good, if not better. Otherwise, people are unlikely to change their habits. So you've got to be aware of what the competition looks like and then choose your strategy that maximises your success based on that. If you're first to market, you've obviously got a bit more freedom in terms of what you do, but you don't want to, typically don't want to do anything that's less than optimal so that you're not vulnerable to a competitor coming along and usurping you. And that comes into mind with forecasting out how long the next store is likely to come into. If you're going into a location like a smaller town where there's not as big of a population, it's likely that only one store is going to be viable. So you can afford to have probably a smaller size shop because there's fewer people in the catchment, and it's less likely that there's going to be a competitor down the track because two stores, say two supermarkets in a small town, just simply won't be viable. So there's a benefit of being first to market there, but you've got to be conscious of when will the next store be, and are we setting ourselves up for success by choosing the size and location that we're going into. The estimated sales bracket, and also if there are stores in the fleet, what's the impact? And we talked about that a bit last week. Having that holistic national check, it's just another way of balancing out what you're putting forward, making sure that where you want to go, the future stores or your current fleet largely represents the composition of the Australian population. As I said, if 25% of the population is in Victoria, you'd probably want about 25% of your stores to be there. That makes sense. So there's an equitable distribution of stores to the population. If 50% of Australia's population growth is in Queensland, you'd want the bulk of your new stores in the future and your gaps to be capturing that growth in Queensland. So there are some aggregate data sets out there and publicly available information. A lot of the population is well documented by the ABS, or there's a number of consulting firms that really specialise in demography, and they look at things like building approvals and other data sets that are available to create their own commercial data set, which is then sold to firms who have an interest in population, and they will also give you an indication of where that population change or growth is going to be. Some of those firms, off the top of my head, ID Consulting, Macro Plan, there's a firm called Precisely, and I'm sure I'm omitting a few, but they're really interesting firms that I'd implore you all to do some Googling on, because regardless of what aspect of property you're interested in, population just can't be ignored. Property is fundamentally a population science. And as many people have said, it's not a quote that can be attributed to me, demography is destiny. So these are just examples of ways in which we make sure that our gaps make sense, and if we're held to account on them, we can explain why we've chosen to put stores in certain locations, and we've cross-checked them against important things like this, but fundamentally population. As a business, like I said, they've got a real interest in a business's growth. So we want to make sure we're getting this network plan or a network plan signed off by the senior members of the business. Applies to any retailer, but this is what the situation at Coles would look like. I've used Coles as an example, but I'm sure this is very, very similar for other retailers. You want to get sign off from the board, who are the custodians of the company, and the executive leadership team who are managing the business. The property leadership team will oversee it, and then the property team are the ones that then go out on the ground, finding the sites in the gaps, and ultimately deliver the new stores in that location. And they can also work with external stakeholders like developers. So finally, it's on us, the location planning team, to make sure that the network plan that we've created and that's been socialised with those stakeholders is available and easily disseminated to the people who need it. So we've got a SharePoint site with a whole lot of other interesting things that fundamentally makes that network plan available to the people who need it. It's both in an Excel format, so you can filter it based on a number of different important variables, like, where are the gaps in Victoria? Where are the gaps that are deemed to be of a priority? Where are the gaps that we need in 0 to 5 years? They're all things that you could filter in the relevant network plan Excel file, or you can get it on a GIS, so that you can look in the locations, and this is clustered on the map. Those numbers on the map show that that's not necessarily the gaps, but just there's 12, could be a Coles, a Woolworths and a Gap and an Aldi in that, location. So once you zoom in, you'd get a better view there. But that's how we help the property team to do their job, which is ultimately deliver those new stores. So that's the summary, and I will quickly jump back. Apologies, the slides aren't in the most logical order, but once that network plan has been created, I come back here to that property process at Coles. So the network plan, like I said, is really step one. Once the property team then has more visibility of where we want to be, they're out there, speaking to developers, they're speaking to landlords. They're using their networks. They're looking at what's publicly listed as being available, and they're identifying the sites in those locations. They'll liaise with us on the suitability of those sites, and we'll provide interim advice. Meanwhile, they're negotiating the terms of what it would cost us to occupy that site, whether it's we acquire it for ourselves in a freehold capacity, or whether we lease a certain amount of square metres within the building. It can take different forms, but they'll negotiate the terms. The agreement will be secured, overseen by property and legal and finance. The board will sign off on that. We'll go on to develop the store or fit it out if it's a leasehold arrangement. It'll be opened. Once it's opened and performing, we'll review if that's in line with our expectations. If the store's doing well after a couple of years, or if it needs a bit of love, it can get a refurbishment. And then once the initial term of the lease is coming to an end, we'll make a decision about whether we stay or go. More often than not, we're staying, but we might want a bit of a rent reduction. Or if we decide to go, we decide, is there a better location within this catchment? Or do we want to get out entirely because the catchment's no longer viable? So that's just a quick high-level summary of the network plan process and how that's brought to life through the Coles property process, which I, without being able to say conclusively, am fairly confident would look fairly similar regardless of which retailer you were at, given that there are just some clear steps along the way and necessary milestones in a property process that just can't be avoided no matter which retailer you are. But like I've said, and I'll always bang on about, the network plan is really the cornerstone of any retailer's business property strategy, but fundamentally, in many respects, their growth strategy as well. So that's just a quick recap on last week. Were there any questions on that one?
Maybe I will ask a question, Toby, if that's okay.
Of course.
I was wondering if there is any difference in approach when the identified site is a land parcel as opposed to a shop in this shopping center, because if it is available shop, then the size of the shop and other decisions are fixed. So does it impact upon the network plan, the availability and nature of site in that location?
Interesting. It's a good question, and as I discussed last week, that freehold or leasehold decision, the freehold decision whether we acquire the site and own the land and develop the shopping centre or the supermarket, and then typically sell it and lease it back with the Coles as the anchor tenant, or whether we just simply go to Vicinity and say we would like to occupy 4,000 square metres in Chadstone. It's good to have that flexibility. Some gaps may be so challenging that the only way in which we can unlock them is by a freehold strategy. I may not be able to fully disclose where, but both Coles and Woolworths have gotten quite creative in the past, and in geographies or gaps for both Coles and Woolworths around the country, where there's not an obvious retail location for either brand to go, and where the other brand already exists, they have to adopt a bit of a covert strategy. So what both Coles and Woolworths have done in the past is that they've gradually bought up individual parcels in certain locations. They may not list their own name on the title. They might use a holding company. And once they've got 4 or 5 individual parcels in a row, they'll then amalgamate the site, seek planning approval to change the use or develop a supermarket, and they will then be able to unlock that gap. Now, that's something that only Coles or Woolworths could do because of their risk appetite and their desire to be there. It'd be very difficult to incentivise a private landlord or a institutional investor to take that approach. They just want a shopping centre to be occupied as quickly as possible, the rent to be paid, and then the return to be achieved. Whereas because we're fundamentally in the business of selling baked beans and groceries and whatnot, we can take a longer term view to unlocking those gaps, because we're interested in operating for the long term, not necessarily about the property development side of things. So I guess what I'm saying with that question and the answer is that we benefit from having the flexibility of both a freehold course of action or a leasehold course of action. Overwhelmingly, it's leasehold, because we don't really consider ourselves a property developer first and foremost, but there are instances where we will go freehold in the interests of unlocking the gap and having a supermarket that operates there in perpetuity, and we'll be able to take risks that a private investor couldn't take on the property strategy, because making a property development profit is nice to us, but fundamentally we're in the interests, we're interested in the retail supermarket profit from the store operation in the long term, rather than the short term property development profit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the concept of waiting power for a large retailer like Coles and Woolworths is definitely, it changes the game and strategy for acquisition of sites. There is a very interesting example in North Melbourne where I live. So at the intersection of Macaulay Road and Canning Street, there was a large land parcel that was acquired by Woolworths long ago, around the GFC time, when the prices were very low. And in, I think, around 2018, that land was developed into a large residential development with Woolworths at the ground floor, with other complementary retailers, like you were mentioning the other day. A typical would be a nail parlor, sushi, and very typical format that you were mentioning the other day. So the ground floor is acquired by all the tenants, and then the development is called Arden Garden, which is a high-rise residential development. So it was a very strategic land acquisition, very timely. And yeah, I would think that the waiting power adds to this kind of risk capacity and speculation in the future on location. Yeah, great, thank you.
Definitely. Pleasure. Now, I'm not sure how viable this will be, but I'm wondering if I play a video, will people be able to hear it?
Let's try that.
All righty. Okay, so just to stop you having to listen to my rambling, I'll play a quick video, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with TED Talks, and I don't think this one is particularly notable. But what I'm introducing here is the notion of Hotelling's law, which I don't think it's a particularly well-founded academic theorem, but it's nonetheless a relevant theory to do with just geography and location decisions. Like I've said, it's that notion of the ice cream stand on the beach. And it was something that was just always taught to me when I was younger as a very sort of flippant example. But bear with it. It's a 4-minute video, and don't expect it to make perfect sense up front. But there are some good sort of general concepts that don't complicate it. It is very simple, but it's just nice to see it in video and with the examples. So we'll just watch that, and then we'll unpack it a little bit more.
Why are gas stations always built right next to other gas stations? Why is it that I can drive for a mile without finding a coffee shop and then stumble across 3 on the same corner? Why do grocery stores, auto repair shops, and restaurants always seem to exist in groups instead of being spread evenly throughout a community? While there are several factors that might go into deciding where to place your business, clusters of similar
Is it just me who lost the sound, or?
I can't hear that either.
Same.
We lost the sound for some reason, Toby. Maybe you want to share the link and I can share the video from my screen.
Sorry, this is chaos. I'm getting a call. So let me.
Yeah, feel free to drop the link on the chat in the chat box.
All right, so then we can regroup in a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
once
sure.
we've all watched it, is that the best course of action? Let me.
Yeah, sure.
So there's the group chat.
Okay. And you can stop sharing while I start sharing.
In fact,
I hope you're able to see my screen. Okay, let's see if it works.
Why are gas stations always built right next to other gas stations? Why is it that I can drive for a mile without finding a coffee shop and then stumble across three on the same corner? Why do grocery stores, auto repair shops, and restaurants always seem to exist in groups instead of being spread evenly throughout a community? While there are several factors that might go into deciding where to place your business.
All right, I think the sound is a little bit low. We couldn't really hear.
Okay, yep.
But I
let's
think,
hope to. But is it coming through?
yes, it's
Okay.
coming through.
Okay, so I'll continue playing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Imagine that you sell ice cream at the beach. Your beach is 1 mile long and you have no competition. Where would you place your cart in order to sell the most product? In the middle. The 1/2 mile walk may be too far for some people at each end of the beach, but your cart serves as many people as possible. One day you show up at work just as your cousin Teddy is arriving at the beach with his own ice cream cart. In fact, he's selling exactly the same type of ice cream as you are. You agree that you will split the beach in half. In order to ensure that customers don't have to walk too far, you set up your cart a 1/4 mile south of the beach center, right in the middle of your territory. Teddy sets up a 1/4 mile north of the center in the middle of Teddy territory. With this agreement, everyone south of you buys ice cream from you. Everyone north of Teddy buys from him, and the 50% of beachgoers in between walk to the closest cart. No one walks more than a 1/4 of a mile, and both vendors sell to half of the beachgoers. Game theorists consider this a socially optimal solution. It minimizes the maximum number of steps any visitor must take in order to reach an ice cream cart. The next day, when you arrive at work, Teddy has set up his cart in the middle of the beach. You return to your location a 1/4 mile south of center and get the 25% of customers to the south of you. Teddy still gets all of the customers north in Teddy territory, but now you split the 25% of people in between the two carts. Day 3 of the ice cream wars, you get to the beach early and set up right in the center of Teddy territory, assuming you'll serve the 75% of beachgoers to your south, leaving your cousin to sell to the 25% of customers to the north. When Teddy arrives, he sets up just south of you, stealing all of the southerly customers and leaving you with a small group of people to the north. Not to be outdone, you move 10 paces south of Teddy to regain your customers. When you take a midday break, Teddy shuffles 10 paces south of you and again steals back all the customers to the far end of the beach. Throughout the course of the day, both of you continue to periodically move south towards the bulk of the ice cream buyers until both of you eventually end up at the center of the beach, back to back, each serving 50% of the ice cream hungry beachgoers. At this point, you and your competitive cousin have reached what game theorists call a Nash equilibrium, the point where neither of you can improve your position by deviating from your current strategy. Your original strategy, where you were each a 1/4 mile from the middle of the beach, didn't last because it wasn't a Nash equilibrium. Either of you could move your cart towards the other to sell more ice cream. With both of you now in the center of the beach, you can't reposition your cart closer to your furthest customers without making your current customers worse off. However, you no longer have a socially optimal solution, since customers at either end of the beach have to walk further than necessary to get a sweet treat. Think about all the fast food chains, clothing boutiques, or mobile phone kiosks at the mall. Customers may be better served by distributing services throughout a community, but this leaves businesses vulnerable to aggressive competition. In the real world, customers come from more than one direction, and businesses are free to compete with marketing strategies by differentiating their product line and with price cuts. But at the heart of their strategy, companies like to keep their competition as close as possible.
The best communication.
Okay. So I will stop sharing here.
Thanks, Jyoti. So, yeah, interesting one. I understand that particular example gets a bit silly, but hopefully that fundamentally or conceptually makes sense. And what that is trying to tell us is that Hotelling's law really just talks to how there's a tendency for competitors to imitate each other in location primarily, but also in things like the goods provided and other essential aspects of their business. And the reason why they imitate each other from a location sense or they co-locate is to attract those consumers who have to travel the shortest possible distance to get to the store. So logically speaking, as I've been saying, a retailer wants to operate right in the middle of where all of the population is, so that people travel the shortest possible distance to get to the retail operation. So then if a competitor comes along, where is the best place for them to locate? Well, the first person's located smack bang in the middle of the population, which is convenient for everyone. Then it makes sense for the competitor to locate right next to them, so they are also maximising their chance of reaching that population. Now, that's pure theory. You'll see that in a lot of case studies. There's also you'd find in real world scenarios that it doesn't always lend itself to the fact that retailers can locate themselves smack bang in the centre of the population. There are pragmatic realities that people have to deal with, or retailers have to deal with, in terms of the planning scheme, what land is available for development of a retail or commercial nature. So then, if they're not in the middle of a population, like the theory would implore them to do, from a strategic property perspective and a competitor's perspective, you can then try and exploit that and understand that if they're not in the centre of the population for whatever reason, or if the population has changed over time and there's growth that sort of changes where the centre of the population is, if you're a competitor, you want to have a look at that and understand where the best next place to go is to offer a more convenient offer to more of the population. So hopefully that makes sense, and it's not something that should be treated as gospel, but like any theory, it does have a lot of contemporary relevance, and there are a number of case studies of it. So fundamentally, that concept that I'm talking about is locational interdependence, and what that's telling us is that the location of industries cannot be understood without reference to the location of other industries of a like kind. So I've had you, as the video suggested, one interesting example that I was always directed to as a young chap was antique shops. You'll find that they typically cluster because it's a very rare and unusual type of retailer, probably a dying one in this day and age. But nonetheless, if there's one, it makes sense for several others to be in that same location, because they probably appeal to a small segment of the population in certain more affluent locations. And then if one is there, it makes sense for another one to co-locate there to maximise its proximity to that suitable population, and also to give the consumers the benefit of price comparisons and the like. Going back to that ice cream sellers scenario, two ice cream sellers in the centre of each half of the beach will end up selling ice cream to the centre of the beach in an equilibrium state, and that's what the video ultimately got to, that they will keep moving to a point when they both have that socially optimal solution, and it inevitably gets to that state, because otherwise one can keep undercutting the other and having that advantage until they're just simply equal. And some would point to that as being assuming that there's no barriers to relocation. That's a really good outcome that enables a market to dictate the best equilibrium state and a fair state for competing offers. And as I've said, the location choice is normally a lot more complex than that. It's a purely theoretical model or construct than that constant minimisation of the differentiation that the ice cream stand scenario talked to. But the logic is absolutely bang on, in that those competing sellers will always look to move to that central, optimal, success maximizing location that hotelling's principle is built upon. So that's the introduction to it. You can either go into the academic theory at length, or you can just fundamentally understand it, like I said, which is that ice cream vendors will look to locate in the middle to maximize the benefit to everyone. They have to walk the shortest possible distance if it's in the middle. And then if another one comes along, it makes sense for it to go right next to it rather than either side, where you're inconveniencing part of the population. Any questions on that one? It lends itself into what is the most I guess extensively covered and most fundamental aspect of property economics, which is that agglomeration economics, which I just can't emphasize enough how fascinating I think this is, and how relevant I think it is. And I would hope that people have covered it, or at least are familiar with the topic, and have had a look at some of the literature available, because there really is an endless trove of this. And that notion of co-location, whether it be offices or retailers, is then what leads to that agglomeration effect, which is that collection or assemblage, and then that is what then has that flow-on ancillary benefit. So I know I'm talking about retail, but the example I think I gave last week, which I'll just touch on again, is just that concentration of an office building with a major tenant, such as Coles. Coles is located in Hawthorn East in the suburbs at a campus-styled office, and interestingly, nearby Coles is Bunnings. They've got their head office nearby. United Petroleum's nearby. Foodworks is nearby. There's a number of other firms that are located in that area. And then what happens when you have a strong concentration of office workers from a similar industry in that location is that they will either formally or informally sort of crossover, which creates that knowledge spillover, which is largely beneficial to everyone involved. Firms, subcontractors that support Coles, they might provide a retail advisory firm in the form of merchandising. They could do that for Coles or Bunnings. It makes sense that they would then locate themselves near two of their major clients. So that's an example of how another firm is then compelled to locate in that area because of the presence of one of those major firms. And then if you've got Coles that employs 4,000 people at head office, and Bunnings that employs 4,000 people at head office, and all of these intermediary firms in the same proximity, because it's logical and rational for them to locate there. You then need, cafes and restaurants and other forms of retail services that locate there, because they're going to benefit from the concentration of, white collar professionals in that area. And that's just how the cycle continues and continues. And it has that agglomeration effect till you get to something like the Silicon Valley, which is really the quintessential example of an agglomeration economy. And that's also supported by a university, and was arguably started by a university in Stanford, which provided first and foremost to that, eventual agglomeration, the very educated and very sort of technically educated workforce that appealed to these firms to locate there. And then that process that I mentioned unfolded. So that's an example of how that location decision then, has and this doesn't happen overnight, it happens over a number of decades, eventually leads to that agglomeration effect, which is really the basis of urban economies and cities more broadly. On a side note, I can't remember what subject it was. It might have been the economies of cities and regions, which hopefully still exists. It was a good subject. Gave me the opportunity to look at Macquarie Park, which has sort of aspirationally been considered Australia's Silicon Valley, which is in the northwestern part of Sydney. That's got Macquarie University, and it's got a number of tech firms in Sydney who are headquartered there. And there has been a concerted effort in the planning scheme to sort of incentivise firms to relocate there. And it's somewhat of an example of an agglomeration in Australia and a tech agglomeration in Australia, albeit nothing quite like the Silicon Valley. So there's a big question now about agglomeration and the relevance and I guess primacy of it now that people are working from home, and cities, which are the quintessential agglomeration as well, will they wane, and will the high street like Chapel Street have a bit of a renaissance because more people are located at home, and will need these shops to meet the needs that the city retailing previously offered. Time will tell, but I suspect there'll be plenty of focus and potentially a few PhDs that cover that topic in the foreseeable future. So that's a bit of a refresh and a bit more detail on agglomeration economics, following on from that Hotelling's law principle. I'll power through these. And I'm jumping around a bit, so apologies, but I'll quickly touch on just sales forecasting. So once we've got the gap, and once we've got the site put to us by the property team, we will do a sales forecast. And the sales forecasting is really just a function, again, of people and the consumer spend potential, the market size, and also some more sort of site-specific components that enhance or detract from the attractiveness of the store among competing offers. So just a quick, it's not it's just the 9 boxes here. It's not a slide each. I'll quickly talk to sales forecasting because we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on that notion of the gravity model. Of course, the network plan is the starting point, as always. Once we get a site given to us, we at Coles do something called ragging, red, amber, green, and we look at some key characteristics like the store location, the supporting retail, the size of the store, its visibility, its access, its car park type, and its car park quality and quantity. And all of those factors are given a red, amber, or a green. Red being, bit of a red flag. Got to be cautious of that because we know, based on our existing fleet, that if the car park is low and poor access exists, and it's a massive deterrent to customers. If the supporting retail doesn't include a fresh food offering or a strong supporting retailer like a chemist or a good cafe, that's unattractive, particularly when you compare it to the closest Woolworths, which might have a really good cafe and a butcher and a baker. If you're a rational customer and those two stores are equidistant from your location, you're more likely to choose the one with the better supporting retail offer. So that is something that needs to be factored in when you're assessing the store. So you've got a bit of a scorecard or a measure of the qualitative factors of the store among the competition when you're looking to do the sales forecast. And then we hone in on the gravity model. I'll cite that now, but we're about to watch a short video and have a bit more of a look at the gravity model. That gives a pretty good gauge of the catchment and based on the total potential sales, which is really just the population in this next box, times the typical dollars spent on food per head per annum, that gives you the total market size per year. So 1,000 people, and one person will typically spend about $6,000 on supermarket goods per year. That gives you the total market size. And then the food market is what all the households are made up of, and you've got to understand what proportion of that total food market will your store likely attract based on its attractiveness compared to the competing offers. So that's the broad gravity model discussion. The forecasting of base sales isn't as relevant for a new store. It's more so relevant if there are impacts. I'll talk to that a bit later, so don't worry too much about that one. We have a bit of a triangulation approach where we use the gravity model, which spits out a sales number. We do some analog forecasting, which means because Coles is a retailer with 800 stores, we know that if a store is about 3,000 square meters, if it's in a metropolitan location, if it's about 500 meters from the competition, and that there are about 5,000 or so people within 10 minutes, we've got 5 to 10 examples of stores that have that same criteria. And if that's the scenario that the proposed location has, we can say, well, we know based on analogous stores, analogs, that when a store has these criteria, it typically does about this sales amount. So we can use that to compare to the gravity model and say, well, the gravity model says this, but comparable stores in our fleet say this. And then we can use what we call golden nuggets, which are some, just key insights that we use with our analytical skills and other data sets that we have available to us to sort of help verify or give more weight to one particular type of forecasting, whether we think the gravity model is more accurate in this case or whether the analogs are more accurate. We use insights, and it's a general term because I don't have any specific examples available at my fingertips now, but we use that sort of third checkpoint to verify the most appropriate option. Once we have a sales figure for year one, we then have typical growth rates. That gives you the profile of the total sales for year 1 to 5 from the proposed launch date. We'll put it in a memo and a pack that finance and property and a number of other teams and operations all contribute to. And then once the feasibility is done with the sales and the other sort of catchment related aspects like the RAG score and the competition analysis are all put together, that goes up to board and they'll say yes or no. And then once it's approved, it's in the hands of the property team and the landlord to deliver. So that's a pretty rough and dirty intro to the sales forecasting process, but we're going to really hone in on the gravity model now, which is an interesting one in my view. I'm tossing up whether we have a look at the video. I don't think it's a particularly long one. Let me just check. Because I want to launch into the scorecard as well. Just while that ad runs, I'll just quickly check how long it is. Yeah, I might just pop it in the chat if that's okay, Jody. Are you all right to play that one again?
Yeah, sure. So you would need to discontinue sharing, Toby. Let me know if the audio and visuals are clear.
We all traveled longer distances to bigger markets to get goods, especially to shop for weddings, etc. There's a law which explains why we travel longer distances to get products. In economics, Riley's law of retail gravitation is a heuristic development by William J. Riley in 1931. According to Riley's law, customers are willing to travel longer distances to larger retail centers given the higher attraction they present to customers. In Riley's formulation, the attractiveness of the retail center becomes the analogy for size or mass in the physical law of gravity. The law presumes the geography of the area is flat without any rivers, roads, or mountains to alter a consumer's decision of where to travel to buy goods. It also assumes consumers are otherwise indifferent between the actual cities. Riley realized that the larger a city, the larger a trade area it would have, and thus it would draw from a larger hinterland around the city. Two cities of equal size have a trade area boundary midway between the two cities. When cities are of unequal sizes, the boundary lies closer to the smaller city, giving the larger city a larger trade area. Riley called the boundary between two trade areas the breaking point, BP. On that line, exactly half the population shops at either of the two cities. The formula is used between two cities to find the BP between the two. The distance between the two cities is divided by 1 plus the result of dividing the population of city B by the population of city A. The resulting BP is the distance from city A to the 50% boundary of the trade area. One can determine the complete trade area of a city by determining the BP between multiple cities or centers. Riley's law holds that trade centers draw consumers from neighboring communities in proportion to the trade area's population and inverse proportion to the distances between the communities and the trade areas. He expresses this relationship in the following formula. MAB is equal to DAB by 1 plus the square root of PB by PA, where MAB is the mass of attraction between A and B, DAB is the distance between A and B, PA is the population of place A, and PB is the population of place B. Electronic commerce. The primary impact of the Internet revolution on marketing is to break the time and location-bound aspects of traditional gravitation commerce. This is a serious charge against retail gravitation theory. The primary objective of any theory is to explain, predict, and understand. Therefore, if retail gravitation theory can no longer explain, predict, or help marketers understand current shopping patterns, then it is no longer useful. With the Internet's ability to fundamentally change the reach, time, and place of companies, retail gravitation laws have become less relevant. Companies small and large are able to achieve a high level of accessibility and establish a two-way information flow directly with end users almost immediately and at low cost. Serving huge numbers of customers efficiently and effectively is made possible by the automation of numerous administrative tasks. Every company is potentially a global player from the first day of its existence. Hedonic consumption. A second major criticism of gravitational models is that they do not capture aspects of hedonic consumption. Retail gravitation theory cannot explain the phenomena of destination shopping, nor can it explain why groups of teenage girls congregate at malls when they have no intention to buy anything. Unlike the concept of shopping as a mission to be accomplished, hedonic-oriented shopping can provide entertainment value and emotional worth. Studies of hedonic consumption focus on arousal, heightened involvement, fantasy and escapism, emotionally laden and subjectively experienced facets of the shopping trip, the in-store experience, and shopping as a means of socialization. Thus, consumers buy so they can shop, not shop so they can buy. Retailers' efforts to satisfy consumers' hedonic experiences are so diverse that they include rock climbing walls in shoe stores, singles nights in grocery stores, and off-road test tracks at Land Rover dealerships. Considering the significance of hedonic consumption, it is surprising that the bulk of the retailing literature has focused on utilitarian consumption. Retail gravity theory is no exception. although a customer satisfaction with a retailer stems from both affective and cognitive elements. Retail gravitation theory focuses only on the cognitive aspects of the shopping decision. That was all for this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel Explify.
So I'll stop sharing here.
Thanks, Jyoti. Now, understand that that goes a bit off script and had some interesting and differing components to it. But fundamentally, I hope the key point of that gravitation was apparent, and it's really just a model and a tool that seeks to explain and predict that consumer shopping patterns and behaviour, and I think it has proven to be largely accurate because of the fundamental basis in which it operates, which is that people factor in the time and the cost of travelling. Therefore, they're more likely to travel shorter distance to meet their needs than longer distances. Very simple. So I've always thought with these theories and equations, you know, they throw a very complex equation at you, but it's normally based on very, very simple concepts. So that was Riley's law of retail gravitation, and it was furthered by David Huff to allow for a whole lot of other variables to be considered rather than just population and distance. The Huff gravity model looks at a whole lot of other factors that may lend itself to the general attraction of the retail offering or attractiveness of the retail offering to help enhance the accuracy and also make it more sort of specific to certain retail types. As I said, the theory of a gravity model in general is that the trade centre draws customers from neighbouring communities in proportion to the trade area's population. So the larger the population, the larger the catchment it will draw from, but it's also inversely proportional to the distance. So the further the distance, the fewer people there will be between communities and the trade areas. So that Huff gravity model equation, to be frank, doesn't even sort of resonate with me, but you've just got to know that the probability of the consumer shopping at the store, which is the end sort of output, is a function of the attractiveness of the store, which can be determined by a whole lot of variables, but primarily the size of the store is considered to be the main attraction. The bigger range, the more attractive, the higher the probability is, but that's also divided by the distance, because the further the distance, the less attractive it seems in that overall attractiveness score. So that's the top half of the equation, and then it's balanced out by the difference or the competing sort of offers within the catchment to give you the overall probability. So that is a crude and very sort of simplistic summary of what a gravity model is, but just think, what do we want to know? The probability of people shopping at our store, our new offering, and that's a function of the attractiveness and the distance. An interesting sort of subset of that, and it's something that I only learned recently, but I think it's important. I know geography to me, half of my colleagues in the location planning team are from overseas, and many of them are from the UK, where they've got a much more established retail market, and they talk a lot about geography, and it's taught very differently in the UK, particularly England, to what it is in Australia. I don't think we actually have a pure geography course in this country, let alone a economic or human geography course. It's not extensively taught at schools as far as I'm aware, but it was only about last year that I learned the first law of geography, Tobler's first law of geography, which was first put forward in 1970, and that is that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Might take a few goes for that to sink in. I know it did for me, but again, really simple. It's just saying that, for example, pollution. The pollution is if it spreads from a source, a factory, the pollution closer to the factory is more related to the factory than the pollution further from the factory, which may be less related to the factory and more related to other things. So crude and simple example, but it can apply to a number of other things. One interesting example of this, and it's not a bad sort of trivia item if you're looking for something at a Zoom party or a party when things open up to excite your friends, is the first example of I guess, how would I put it? Some people say it's the first example of sort of data journalism or you know, GIS solving problems. Not that it was a GIS, but a man by the name of John Snow, and not the John Snow that most of us are familiar with, but I think he was an epidemiologist by trade, and this was a long time ago, centuries ago. Noticed during a cholera outbreak in London that he went to the effort of drawing on a map using these bars to show the incidence of a cholera case in London. And the higher the bars, the more cases there were of cholera. And then what he did was, the theory was that this was airborne. And as a doctor, that didn't seem right to him. It was a bacterial disease, and the symptoms of individuals who were infected, it didn't sort of resonate with him that was plausible. So he mapped all of the cases, and then he identified, from looking at what else was available to him and from the layout of the town, that cases were quite heavily concentrated around one particular water pump. And in a very crude and simplistic sense, this has got a lot of literature on it because of how consequential it was, but he essentially used this map and the cases and the pump to show that the cases were clustering around the pump, and he then used that to prove that it was being transported through water, and there was one particular pump that was causing that problem. So some people describe it as a map that changed the world. There's quite a good Guardian article on it there, which I implore everyone to have a flick through. And like I said, it's not a bad party trick if you're looking for something to chat about. So that example and other examples relating to the first law of geography, it just goes to the heart of location. And as property students, you know, you'd always hear about the importance of location, but hopefully these practical and theoretical examples are really giving more meaning as to why location is paramount. But it also puts forward this notion of a distance decay. And a distance decay is just that theory or that phenomena that the further away you are from something, a good or a service, the less likely you are to make use of it. Simple example is of people in a rural area less likely to come into the CBD for a good, even if it is bigger and better, just because it doesn't make sense for them to do so. That is the progression of that friction of distance scenario, and it puts forward those questions: are customers willing to travel to a nearer shop if it's bigger? Maybe if it's the only, you know, if the Kmart is, or the Bunnings is 20, 30 kilometres away and it's the only one, sure, they'll probably go to that one. They may go less frequently, but if it's the closest one, they may be willing to make that distance. But if there was one closer, they wouldn't go to the one further away. Or are customers more likely to travel to their local shop, and are they willing to make concessions in terms of the range and the price in the interest of distance? For example, at lunch, I know that kombucha is cheaper at the Coles a kilometre away, but I just went to the 7-Eleven to get one because I only wanted to walk 2 minutes to the 7-Eleven rather than 10 minutes to the Coles. Again, trivial example, but hopefully it serves a point. I'm not wasn't paid by kombucha to say that. The gravity model is, I guess, fleshed out in a really simplistic way in these 3 steps, which I'll just quickly talk to. And there are some maps, and I will qualify that this isn't my original work. It's largely taken from a geography website, so I'll adequately source that when I put forward these slides, and apologies they weren't available earlier. But the first step to sort of the gravity model, and I caveat that the gravity model that I use is really just, push of a button and then it spits it out once I've provided the inputs. But what it's doing in the background of the gravity model is that the first thing it does is it calculates the distance from the stores to the census geographies, the residential locations, and then it has a score that's associated with each store and each census geography. Once that distance score has been created, then an attractiveness score is created, and that's then added to the model. And the attractiveness score is related to the size, and like I said, it's inversely proportional to the distance. So then the size of the store is factored in, and that gives you the total attractiveness. So you've got distance, for example, from store 1 to, say, this census geography in the far right hand corner. The distance will be high, but if the store's a bit bigger, if it's the biggest one in the catchment, the attractiveness might be a bit higher, and that will balance out the distance score. So that's a crude sense of how it works. And then when you plot this on a map with all of the distance scores for each store to each geography, and the attractiveness from each geography to each store, for example, that middle map, retail store 3, will attract the red census geographies more based on its distance to the store. So that second map is just that attractiveness factor and how it relates for store 3. The further away you are, the less attractive. The closer you are, the more attractive it is. And then the final step is just that probability factor for each retail store across the broader market. For that map on the far right hand side with step 3 above it, that's looking at store 1 specifically, and it's talking about what is the relevant market share that store 1 will achieve among these this total market and each individual census geography. So what this is saying is that within that core catchment for store 1, those immediate census tracts immediately around it, it's going to get a very high proportion of the trade because it makes the most sense and it's the most convenient for these stores to go there. Now, I don't have this information in front of me, but store 1 might be the Chadstone. It might be really big as well. So it's even though these are sort of halfway between store 3 and store 1, it looks like store 1's getting quite a decent chunk of the market share, and that might be because store 3 is very small and less attractive, and store 1 is the same distance and it's got a bigger store size or a better range. So in spite of it being equidistant to these ones in the middle, they're more inclined to go to store 1 because it's more attractive. But if you're out here, in the far right-hand corner near store 5, store 1's getting a very low market share of that part of the overall catchment because it just doesn't make sense for people who live there to go past store 5, past store 3 to store 1. So that's just an example of how once you've got the distance score, the attractiveness score, you can then, by pulling those together and doing the calculation for each census tract with those relevant variables, you can get what the estimated probability is and then assign that as a market share for the store. So that's broadly speaking how it's done, but understand that's a high level summary and there's a bit more detail that goes into it, but hopefully the fundamentals and the conceptual nature of it is is a bit clearer. I talked about cannibalization impacts and net new sales last week. That's not entirely relevant to what we do. I'm talking about today, very relevant to what we do. But I guess once you've got the probability of trade and the sales, if you know store 1 is new and store 3 is another Coles, and historically, assume store 1 didn't exist, store 3 would have captured most of this trade. If we're going to plonk a new store where store 1 is, and historically those locations all shopped at store 3, by opening store 1, store 3 is going to get clobbered, and there's going to be an impact. So that's when we need to know, based on the sales that store 1 are estimated to do, how much of that's going to come from store 3, and once we've forecast that impact, we can measure it by saying what would store 3 have done if store 1 never came, and that's the base sales. So let's assume store 1 never turned up. It would have just kept going along like this. But we know that in reality, store 1 is coming, and from that point that it opened, store 3's sales started to go down, and then the difference between what store 3 was doing once store 1 opened versus what store 3 we think it would have done if it didn't open is the impact. Before I get into the Excel part of the lecture/workshop, I want to give GIS a plug. I know you guys have done a bit, but I was only introduced to it at uni, and I loved it. Really challenging at first, and a bit daunting, but I really can't emphasize enough how valuable this skill set is for students, particularly property students in this day and age. Property is comprised of a lot of people. It's a big industry, so it's a really great way to differentiate yourself by having this skill set. And also a GIS, a geographic information system, is really just helping to convey location and location-based characteristics. So it is so integral to what property does. And like I said, it's a great way to convey complex information in an appealing way. It's helps improve the communication and knowledge sharing of what you're trying to get across. It's very interactive and very dynamic, and it ultimately helps to make better decisions. But I just felt when I was introduced to it for the first time as a student, I thought, oh gosh, this is really scary. This isn't just an essay or a couple of quiz questions, but it was a genuine skill. It was a hard skill, and university is a great place to establish those, because it's a supportive environment, and you're not going to get sacked if you don't do it well. You probably won't in the workplace either, not to be too concerned. But the point is, it's a really great place to learn and trial these things. And QGIS, which is what I know you use at uni, and what I used previously, is open source. So there's a huge amount of information online, because it's free and because it's used by a large amount of people globally. There's all this free information online. So if you come across a problem, you can Google it. There's normally a thread, or you can come to specific websites like this, QGIS tutorials and tips. And there's an incredibly altruistic and open source community out there that's willing to help and support people in doing this. So I'm a huge advocate of GIS in general, and I sort of say it changed my life, and it did, because it helped me get a job in that industry, and it's opened my eyes up to skills that help me sell myself as a professional and make me a more effective person. And I even go to the extent of making maps in my spare time sometimes. And again, not a bad party trick if you're looking for one. I've put here the Esri ArcGIS MOOCs. Again, you may not be as odd as I am and want to do this in your spare time, but Esri is the world gold standard in terms of mapping technology. Now, it's a licensed product, so it costs money for people to use this product, but they run 6 MOOCs, massive open online courses a year, which are free and give you free access to their licensed material. I am 100% going to sign up to both of these ones, the Going Places for Spatial Analysis and the Spatial Data Science, because it is a really good and structured 6-week free course into using their tools and using GIS. And again, on a CV, if you're going to a firm, to say that you've got experience with GIS in general, let alone Esri's GIS products, and you've got maps and products or outputs to show from these courses, it's only going to enhance your employment prospects, let alone your general sort of knowledge and fulfillment from doing it. So there's no obligation to do those, of course, and if you start, it's on you to do it or not. No one's going to pick you up if you don't, but it's free, and while you're students and have relatively more time than you will later in life, I'd strongly encourage you to explore it at the very least, and who knows, you might fall in love with it. So I just thought I'd make people aware of that, because like I said, I think GIS is an amazing tool for our generation. And sorry, another colleague wanting to know where that piece of work is. Sorry, it's not done. So the next thing, I mentioned mobile phone data last week, so I won't bang on about that, but I will talk to just Uber Media and Paths and encourage everyone to just do some Googling on that and understand again how the property industry is evolving. It's not just deals and bricks and mortar. It's now like quite technical and quite data driven. So do take an interest in how the industry is evolving and stay ahead of the curve. And while you're students, experiment with this stuff and understand it. I understand it's daunting, and I'm not an expert in any of it, but I do understand how it works, who the players are in the property technology space, and I can talk the language, which really helps me hold my own. I'm not an expert by any means, but it is really worth understanding where the industry is going in this regard and how it's used. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at that. And just some dot points before we launch into the Excel stuff. Like I've said, retail is a people science. I've always thought an interesting example is in New York City, if anyone's ever been, the street carts there. There are some fairly generic ones, but the street carts change over time to provide food that normally reflects the immigration patterns of America. So there was a wave of Chinese immigration to America in the 80s, and the street carts started to take on, more of an Asian cuisine. There's been a large sort of Hispanic or Mexican influx into America in the last few decades, and then street carts started to take on that blend, and then more recently there's been Middle Eastern migration to America. So street carts would take on that shape, and it's sort of the retail offering responding to the changing demographics and the changing population. And that's a trivial example, but retail is only as good as the proportion of people it's appealing to, and the more appealing you can be, the more probability, or the greater probability you can give yourself of appealing to more people, whether it's in location or product, the more successful you're going to be. So that's I think the people nature of it, and sales are really just a function of customers. So the thing I love about retail property in particular is that every day, every week, we get feedback on how our property is performing, how our store is performing in the form of sales. And if sales are up, that's a good sign. And if they're going down and we've got fewer transactions, or people are spending less money at the store, because a sale is really made up of the basket size and the number of transactions. That's how you get the total sales figure. If sales are going down, it's driven by fewer transactions or people buying less per shop. That gives us information to understand, is the car park driving people away, or is the range too small and people can't do their full shop? Do we need to make the store bigger? We always get feedback in the form of sales, and when you overlay that with some of the more qualitative feedback from customer surveys, it really enables you to look at the retail property and the levers that we've got as a retailer and a property team to help steer the business in the right direction, or the stores in the right direction, based on that information and feedback we get from the population who shop at our store. So that's why I quite like retail, because it's always giving us that information and feedback in the form of sales, and it's not really just, you know, build and sell and then next. Not that I'm overly simplifying, not wanting to overly simplify other aspects of the industry, but that's why I prefer retail. I've mentioned about data-driven. Stay on top of it and just enjoy it. Don't be daunted by it, especially while you're a student. Just face into it and learn as much as you can. And retail property and property economics are massive, and pretty much every retailer, particularly the bigger ones, have a property team, and most of them have graduate programs. So and even if not a graduate program, they'll have entry-level roles. So do some Googling. You know, have a look at the people who are in those industries on LinkedIn, and you'll get a feel for the things that people have done before, or the roles available in these teams, and hopefully it gives you an idea of where you want to be and what you want to do, and makes you realise that there's a lot of options out there for property students. So I again commend you on that decision you've made to study property. The Coles graduate program, I just thought I'd give it a quick plug. It's there's a website. I don't have it here. I'll make sure it's included in the slide I updated slides I send across. But have a look at that. There's an intake normally towards the end of the year for the following year. There's a property team. There's a property graduate program, and that gives you really good broad exposure to the entire property function within Coles. You spend a bit of time in store. I did 2 months at a store down in Geelong, and that's important, helps you understand the core business. But then I was straight into head office, working in the property team, everything from the investment management, lease management, retail property, the location planning team, the construction team. I did a bit of time working directly with the general manager. So it was a really great introduction to property and all of the different aspects. And then having that exposure enabled me to choose what I wanted to do next. So I am definitely an advocate for retail property and Coles, and would be happy to field any questions from anyone either today or separately. I'll provide my contact details if anyone wants to unpack that one a bit more. Cool. If there's any questions, I'll take them, but if not, I might just have a quick 5-minute breather and take my jumper off before I do the Excel and the GIS, because it could heat up.
It looks like everyone is really enjoying listening to you, Toby.
Great. Well, if you'll just give me a moment, I'll just have a minute or two, and I'll pull together the files that I need just to work on the scorecard method. We're not going to get through it all in the lecture, but I'll try and make it so it's an even break, and then we'll have the hour off and come back and finish it off in the workshop.
Yeah, sure. I think let's take a 5 minutes break and meet again at 3:35. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll share my screen. Is the scorecard approach, and I should not have closed the lecture. I'll just pull that back up quickly. So the so I've referred to it as a hotspot map here, but it's also known as a scorecard approach, which ultimately results in a hotspot map. And what we're doing here is we're selecting key variables that will help understand or determine a retailer's performance. And then we're going to make sure that we, using those variables, rank them and understand where the confluence, where the combination of those variables with a favourable score are. So to do that, you've got to start with a geography, and I understand in the tutorial that was done a few weeks ago, you looked at the SA2s, the statistical area 2 structures, which is just an area that the census is calculated in. Its SA1s are obviously the smallest, and there's 57,000 odd SA1s around the country. And that's normally about 150 households per SA1. SA2s are normally made up of 1 or 2, sometimes 3 SA1s. So they're a bit larger in size in terms of their area, and they're also larger in terms of their population. But the census can be segmented by a whole range of different geographies, but SA1 and SA2 are typically the most granular, being the smallest and the most detailed, which helps you make a more specific and nuanced location-based decision. So some of the key variables that dictate success, obviously the main one that I've talked about is population. So the higher the population, the typically more successful your store will be. Population density is also an important factor. That sort of adjusts and smooths out the area. So you can have, a very large population, but if it's a very large SA2 or geography and size, if it's a very large area, you'd expect the population to be bigger. So when you divide the population by the area of the geography, that helps you understand how dense it is. And obviously, you'd know that the inner urban areas are a lot denser, and density has a positive correlation to sales typically, all else being sort of equal. And that's why you get that concentration of retail activity in cities. It comes back to that agglomeration effect and that Hotelling's law. And that's why it's harder to get stores to succeed in more rural areas, because there is a population, but it's more spread out and less economical for retailers to open a number of stores. So that's why population density is important. There's some generic examples. You can look at the SA1 or the SA2, and based on, it may not be a publicly available data set, you can certainly calculate this using an ABS data set. You can look at the past growth. You can look at how the population has changed over a number of years, and see which SA1s or which SA2s have experienced the most growth. And as long as you've got a score next to each SA1 or SA2, that's the main starting point, and I'll show that shortly. Another example is the CEFA score, which is a generic Australian Bureau of Statistics figure, stands for Socio-Economic Index for Areas, which gives a number that reflects the relative socio-economic advantage or the affluence and a number of other things of a particular area. So they're just examples of some metrics that typically the higher the population, the higher the population density, the higher the CEFA, the higher the population growth, the better chance your store has of success. So the key sort of element for us as location professionals is to understand what variables, what demographic variables or what statistics will help us decide which locations are the most suitable for us to locate in. So what I'll drag across is what should be your best friend, which is the Australian Bureau of Statistics website. It sure as hell is my best friend. And you open up the data packs, and I'm happy to provide this website. But if you just Google it, 2016 census data packs, it's really quite extraordinary in that you go to the 2016 census, or you might want the 2011 census. You choose what you want, which is the general community profile. That's the general census, which hopefully most of you have just done. If you haven't, you should, because it's a very important public resource. That's the general community profile, and then you choose the geographies. So, like I said, SA1 is the smallest, most granular statistical area that the census is measured by. But you can also go SA2, 3, 4, and then SA4s are quite large. The next biggest statistical area is the state, and then the country. But it's also got things like local government areas, the state electorate, the federal electorate. So it gives you all the data you can possibly imagine, and it fits it into that area so that you can analyse it accordingly. So we want SA2, and then you can pick, do you want that for Australia? Do you want it for New South Wales? Which state do you want it for? Or do you want it all in one big shape file? Now, we don't want it in a shape file yet. We'll get it in a shape file a bit later, but we want it for Victoria. So that's all good. That's quite a big file. It's a zip file, so that's just loading. Once it's loaded, we'll open it up. At the time, housemates must have clocked off and started watching Netflix. That's loaded. So I'll open this up. Quite a big file, not to be daunted by it or deterred. So my downloads folder is pretty ugly, but fundamentally that's what I've just opened. This is the 2016 Commonwealth General Community Profile, SA2 for Victoria. So that's what's just been downloaded. Now, first place to go is, well, the logical place to start is you open it up and then you've got, gosh, this is massive. What's in here? This is every single field of the census. Now, that's not much good to us like that. So if you go to the metadata and the metadata Excel file, yep, that's fine. What that file within the zip file that we've just downloaded shows us is what does each of those files and their title correspond to. So table Excel file or table number 1, selected persons characteristics by sex, and then the type of measurement, it's just the number of persons, age by gender, the ancestry, education levels. So this gives you that corresponding, gives you a bit more detail about what each of those files is telling you. Now, why am I showing you this? Because this is where you'd want to come as a retail property professional, as an analyst, to understand, right, if I've got a retailer and my retailer is selling, you know, a certain type of product, what are the demographics that I want to appeal to? Once you've got a feel for what those demographics are, you'd come to the census, or you'd look at the census and you know, the example I'm going to use in my tutorial is a retailer that's providing goods for you know, babies and young families, like Baby Bunting, that maybe a competitor to Baby Bunting. And if you're selling products that appeal to babies and children and young families, of course, those generic variables that I talked about, population size, affluence, because the more wealthy people are, the more they spend, population density, all of them are just generic across retail. But we want to know what are the industry specific, what are the brand specific variables that we can find on the internet or publicly available sources that will help us locate the best places for us to put our stores. So some of the variables that come to mind, or I'd be happy to hear some from the floor. The variables that come to mind for me are, we probably want to look at the age. We want to know households and persons in areas. We want to know where there's people between the age of 0 to 10, and where there's families, people between the age of 40 to 50. Where are the areas that have a high concentration of those people? We want to know where are the married people? Which locations have a high proportion of married people? We might want to look at things like unpaid domestic work, unpaid childcare. If there is a lot of unpaid childcare in a household, to me, as an analyst, logically that would appear as if someone's doing unpaid childcare because they have a younger child. Therefore, a retail offering that has products for people to buy for children would be more viable in those areas. The family composition, you want family households. And then there's a whole lot of other things that also you can look at. The occupation, there's normally one in here on vehicle, number of motor vehicles. So if a household, again, this is me getting a bit abstract, but the number of households, the number of motor vehicles in a dwelling, a household, if there's more than 2, to me that says that there might be a younger child, as in an adult, who is no longer of a young age. So if you looked at a household that had 1 or 2 cars, to me that lends itself to saying that they don't yet have adult children, but they might have younger children that don't have a car. So these are just examples of variables that we can use and pull in to better understand the different ways in which we can segment the country or the geography that we're looking at to ensure that there is a more scientific view of what we're doing. So, for example, I think one of the ones that we agreed we'd look at was, let's just look at the first one, number of persons, or why don't we look at age? So we want the number 4. Of course, feel free to join along at home, but hopefully this, hopefully what's being recorded enables you to go back and look at it freely in your own time and pause it or play it slower in case I'm talking too quickly. So we're just going to open up the GO4 and we'll expand the Excel file. And you can see here in the primary firstmost column, you've got the SA2 and every single SA2 in Victoria. So there's 464 SA2s in Victoria. And then for each SA2, it's got the number of people who are between 0 and 1, male, female, and then P, persons. So the combination of both, which doesn't always marry up perfectly, but when you're conducting a survey across the whole country, there are some errors. But that's fundamentally what the column headers are saying. Age, year 0 male, age year 0 female, age year 0 persons total. And it has that for pretty much every age. So this is a pretty big file. So much so that GO4A, Vic, A is the first one, and B takes you from the end, which was 55 females. It'll probably start at 55 persons in GO4B. So if I pull across GO4B, you ultimately get each individual year, 55, 57, 60, all the way through to dare I say, probably 100. And then it gets to a point where it stops going up by individual years, and then it starts to go up by blocks. So it's now going up by 5-year, or it was going up by 5-year intervals. We ultimately want to get to the end, and then it gives us the total male, total female, and total persons for each SA2. While we're doing this in the background, what you want to start to do is create a fresh file, which is what we'll do at the start of the workshop, which just has the SA2s. I've just copied the SA2s and open up book 5. And then what we're going to start to do is, based on each of these individual variables that we select, we want to start pulling them across into a fresh file. So we might want age, 5 to 9, or if there's one a bit younger, 0 to 4. We want persons aged 0 to 4, because the more people there are 0 to 4 in a SA2, the more successful, I would think, a retailer or an offering that sells products to a younger child would be. So that's the first step. You've got the SA2s, every single SA2 in Victoria. There's the first variable that we've chosen. In the workshop, we'll unpack a few more of the variables, and rest assured, I'm not going to bore you with step by step. I have ultimately gotten us to a point where I've done this, and I'll run through each one, where we have the raw data file with every single variable. We take the absolute number and get the ratio, so it's a proportion. What proportion of people were 0 to 14 in this SA2, so it adjusts for population. We then score each one of these variables based on the scoring system that we put in place, and this is dynamic. So we're saying that if you're between the minimum total persons and the Q1, the first 25%, you get score 1. So for example, this variable here was 8,345 people in this SA1. So we said if you're between 7,000, which is the first quartile, and the second quartile, you get a score of 2. So that's accurate there. Between 7,000 and that, you get 2. And then once you've done that for everyone, you get a score, you put it in a bucket, you check the distribution, and you then have a file that you can pull into your GIS, and we bring it to life. So that's the brief synopsis of what I'll unpack a bit more in the workshop. I won't bore you with each individual step, but we'll unpack it a bit, and we'll bring it into the GIS, and we'll talk about how we can bring it to life using some heat maps, and how we can also start to show what a bit of a trade area looks like, and how we can have some really rigorous data on that trade area that helps us prove why we as a retailer would want to go into a certain location. So that's just a bit of a brief intro about where we're heading for the workshop. Hopefully that excites everyone, and they stick around, but understand if that is a bit daunting now, but it will be made a lot simpler in the workshop when we dabble into it a bit more. So something to look forward to.
Great. So I think let's stop here, Toby. And I I think it will be wonderful to continue this in the workshop, and we will also have more students joining in the workshop. So it will be a little break and a good one for you too, to just get some coffee and tea and refresh yourself. And also, if you all have questions, I think 1 hour will give you some time to absorb the lecture content and apply it in the workshop. So if you have questions, probably I think it will be good to start with taking questions in the workshop and then continuing with the hands-on session. So thank you everyone for joining here, and see you again in 1 hour's time at the workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby. See you again.
Speak soon.